The diplomatic station called Threshold hung in the darkness between stars like a jewel made of metal and light. And inside its great hall, the fate of humanity was about to be decided by creatures who had ruled the galaxy for longer than humans. Had existed as a species. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood at the center of the human delegation, her gray uniform sharp and her dark eyes calm as she watched the 12 alien ambassadors take their seats around the curved table that dominated the room. The Concord of 12 had controlled this part of the galaxy for 50,000 years, and they had seen countless species rise from their homeworlds, only to be absorbed into their great alliance, whether those species wanted it or not. The Velith ambassador was the first to speak, and his voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder as his massive form shifted in his specially designed chair. "You are the humans," Coruscant said, and his 4 eyes blinked slowly as he looked down at the small creatures before him. "We have watched your species crawl from your single world and spread to a handful of nearby systems over the past 3 centuries, and the Concord has decided it is time to welcome you into our family." Tanaka did not flinch at his condescending tone, and she had dealt with worse in her 70 years of life. "We thank the Concord for this meeting," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "The humanity has not come here seeking membership in your alliance, and we wish only to establish our borders and live in peace." A sound rippled through the alien ambassadors that might have been laughter, and the insectoid Rithaki representative clicked her mandibles in what Tanaka recognized as amusement. "You misunderstand," Coruscant continued. "Membership in the Concord is not optional for species in our territory, and this has been the law since before your kind learned to make fire, and it will remain the law long after your brief civilization has faded." He gestured with one massive hand, and a holographic document appeared in the air between them. "The provision requires all new species to submit biological samples from their population, complete archives of their technology, and detailed maps of all their territories and military installations," he explained. "This is for the safety and security of the galaxy, and you have 100 of your years to comply." Tanaka studied the document for a long moment, and then she looked up at the assembled ambassadors with an expression that none of them could read. "No," she said simply. The chamber fell silent, and Coruscant leaned forward with confusion evident in every line of his massive body. "Perhaps you did not understand," he said slowly. "This is not a request, and species who refuse the provision are integrated by force, and your small collection of worlds would fall within a single cycle of your sun." Tanaka nodded as if she had expected this response. "I understood perfectly," she replied, "and my answer remains no. And humanity will not submit samples of our people for your study, and we will not hand over our technology for your analysis, and we will not reveal the locations of our military forces." She paused, and something shifted in her eyes that made even the massive Velith lean back slightly. "But I will give you something else," she continued. "I will give you a warning, and I will give it only once, so I suggest you listen carefully." The ambassadors exchanged glances, and amusement still dominated their expressions, but there was also a hint of curiosity at this strange little creature who dared to threaten the masters of the galaxy. "Do not test us," Tanaka said, and her voice carried through the chamber like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "Do not send probes into our space, and do not abduct our people for study, and do not think that our small size or our young civilization makes us weak." She took a step forward, and her small frame seemed to fill the room. "Humanity has survived extinction 7 times on our homeworld," she said. "We survived ice ages that covered our planet in frozen death, and we survived plagues that killed half our population, and we survived asteroids and supervolcanoes and predators that hunted us through the long, dark nights of our evolution." Her eyes moved across the assembled aliens, and she saw creatures who had evolved as the dominant species on their worlds. creatures who had never known what it meant to struggle for survival against impossible odds. We did not survive by being gentle, she finished, and we did not survive by being merciful, and if you come for us, we will show you exactly how a prey species learns to become the most dangerous thing in its ecosystem. Coruscant stared at her for a long moment, and then he burst into laughter that shook the walls of the chamber, and the other ambassadors joined him in their various ways of expressing amusement. The barking of a small creature, he said finally, wiping moisture from his eyes. How delightful and how utterly foolish. But we are patient, and we will give you your 100 years to reconsider, and when that time has passed, we will come for your worlds, whether you are ready or not. Tanaka simply nodded, and she turned and walked out of the chamber without another word, and her delegation followed in silence. The Concord ambassadors watched them go, and already they were forgetting about the strange little species and their empty threats, and they had more important matters to discuss than the fate of a handful of primitive worlds. But Admiral Tanaka was not thinking about the meeting anymore as she walked to her shuttle, and she was thinking about the message she would send home and the preparations that would begin immediately. Humanity had given its warning, and now they would spend the next century making sure that when the Concord came, they would face something that would shake the foundations of their ancient alliance. The shuttle lifted off from the station and jumped into faster-than-light travel, and behind them, the Concord continued its business as it had for 50,000 years. Confident in its power and certain of its supremacy, they did not know that they had just made the worst mistake in the history of the galaxy, and they would not realize until it was far too late. For 98 years, humanity went silent, and they closed their borders and they vanished from galactic affairs as if they had never existed at all. And in that silence, they prepared for what was coming. The galaxy forgot about the small species with their empty warnings and their primitive worlds, and life continued as it always had under the watchful eye of the Concord. But humanity remembered every word that had been spoken in that chamber, and they remembered the laughter and the condescension and the certainty that they were nothing more than another weak species to be absorbed. They would make the galaxy remember too, and when that day came, the Beloy Concord would finally understand why some warnings should never be ignored. 98 years had passed since the humans had walked out of the diplomatic chamber on Threshold Station, and in all that time, not a single transmission had come from their space, and not a single ship had crossed their borders. The Rethaki Queen Admiral Veshkira stood on the command deck of her flagship and stared at the star charts that showed the boundaries of human territory, and she felt nothing but contempt for the species that hid behind those invisible lines. The Rethaki were an insectoid species with hard shells and sharp mandibles, and they had conquered 17 worlds in their history, and they had never encountered an enemy they could not break. The Concord grows impatient. Her second-in-command clicked beside her. The 100 years are nearly complete, and the humans have not submitted to the provision, and the other species watch to see how we will respond. Veshkira turned her multifaceted eyes toward her subordinate, and her antennae twitched with anticipation. Then we will show them, she replied. Prepare a probe fleet of 12 vessels and send them into human space to scan and map their territories. And if they resist, then we will know they are hostile, and we will have our justification for war. The probe fleet departed within the cycle, and they crossed into human space with their sensors active and their weapons ready, and they expected to find primitive defenses and outdated technology. They found nothing. The 12 ships moved deeper into human territory, and they scanned world after world, but they found no signs of the humans, and no ships came to intercept them, and no warnings were broadcast on any frequency. And then between one moment and the next, all 12 ships simply vanished. There was no distress signal and no sensor data transmitted back, and no explanation for what had happened to 2,000 Rethaki soldiers and their advanced warships. Veshkira received the news in silence, and her mandibles clicked together in a pattern that her crew recognized as barely controlled rage. They dare, she hissed. They dared to destroy ships of the Rithaki Dominion without even the courtesy of a declaration of war. She turned to her communications officer, and her voice was cold with fury. Assemble a war fleet. She commanded. 200 of our finest vessels and 20,000 ground troops, and we will go to their border colony called New Geneva. And we will take prisoners and seize their technology, and we will teach these mammals their place in the galaxy. The fleet assembled within days, and it was the largest Rithaki force deployed in 3 generations, and every soldier was eager to avenge their fallen comrades and to crush the arrogant humans who had dared to challenge them. They arrived at New Geneva expecting desperate resistance and orbital defenses and warships scrambling to protect the 3 million humans who lived on the surface. They found nothing but silence. The planet hung in space like a blue-green jewel, and there were no defensive platforms orbiting it and no military vessels guarding it, and the cities on the surface showed no signs of evacuation or panic. Veshkira studied the sensor readings with growing confusion, and she could not understand what kind of species would leave their own people undefended against an invasion force. Perhaps they are even more primitive than we thought. Her second-in-command suggested, perhaps they do not have the ships to defend their colonies, and they simply hope we will show mercy. Veshkira made the clicking sound that served as Rithaki laughter. Then they hope in vain, she replied. Begin the landing and take prisoners from every city, and show no mercy to any who resist. The dropships descended through the atmosphere, and they landed in the largest city, and the Rithaki soldiers poured out with their weapons ready, and their mandibles eager for combat. The streets were empty, and the buildings were silent, and there was no one to fight, and then the first soldier collapsed. It happened without warning and without explanation, and one moment he was standing guard at an intersection, and the next he was on the ground with his shell cracking and his internal organs liquefying inside his body. More soldiers fell, and then more, and within an hour hundreds of Rithaki were dying in the streets of New Geneva, and they could not see their enemy, and they could not fight back. Veshkira watched the reports coming in from the surface, and she felt something she had never experienced before in her long military career. She felt fear. What is happening down there? She demanded. What is killing our soldiers? Her science officer studied the data with trembling appendages, and when she looked up, her compound eyes were wide with horror. It is a pathogen, she said, a biological weapon designed to target Rithaki physiology. Specifically, it attacks our respiratory system and our nervous system and our digestive system simultaneously. And there is no cure and there is no treatment. The pathogen spread from the surface to the ships in orbit, and it traveled through the air recycling systems, and it infected every Rithaki on every vessel, and within 6 hours, the entire invasion force was dying. Veshkira collapsed on her command deck as her body failed her, and her last sight was the blue-green world of New Geneva, hanging peacefully in the viewport, and her last thought was a single desperate question. How had they known? The last ship fell silent, and 200 Rithaki warships became tombs drifting in orbit around a human colony. And 20,000 soldiers died without ever seeing the enemy that killed them. And then a single transmission broadcast from New Geneva to every receiver in Concord space. The message contained only 3 words: we warned you. The Concord received the transmission, and they saw the images of the dead fleet, and they read the reports of the biological weapon that had been designed specifically to kill Rithaki, and they began to wonder what else humanity had been preparing during their 98 years of silence. The Velith ambassador Coruscant remembered the small human admiral who had stood before him nearly a century ago, and he remembered her warning, and he remembered how he had laughed. He was not laughing anymore. The other species of the Concord began to ask questions that had never occurred to them before, and they wondered if the humans had designed weapons for them as well, and they wondered what other secrets hid behind those silent borders. Fear spread through the Concord like a virus of its own, and for the first time in 50,000 years, the great powers of the galaxy looked at a younger species with something other than contempt. They looked at humanity with terror, and somewhere in the darkness of human space, Admiral Tanaka's successor smiled as she read the reports of the Ritahaki defeat, and she knew that this was only the beginning. The humans had spent a century preparing for this moment, and they had barely revealed the smallest fraction of their capabilities, and the galaxy would soon learn just how dangerous a cornered species could become. The warning had been given, and the warning had been ignored, and now the consequences would unfold across every world and every species that had thought humanity was nothing more than prey to be hunted. They were about to discover how wrong they had been. The Morath were known throughout the Concord as the masters of infiltration and espionage, and their four-armed bodies could adapt to almost any environment, and their intelligence operatives had never failed to complete a mission in 10,000 years of service. Thiessen was the greatest of them all, and he had stolen secrets from fortress worlds and assassinated targets in their own bedrooms, and he had never been caught, and he had never been seen when the Concord Council summoned him to a secret meeting. He knew that they were desperate, and he knew that whatever mission they had for him would be the most dangerous of his long career. The humans have become a problem, Coruscant said, his massive form hunched over the table as if the weight of his fear was pressing him down. We need to know what they have been building behind their borders, and we need to know before we make our next move. Thiessen studied the data they gave him, and he saw the images of the dead Ritahaki fleet, and he read the analysis of the biological weapon that had killed him, and he understood why the Concord was afraid. This will not be easy, he said. The humans have closed their borders completely, and no ship has entered or left their space in nearly a century, and we know nothing about their current capabilities. That is why we need you, another council member replied. You are the only operative who might be able to infiltrate their territory and return with the intelligence we need. Thiessen accepted the mission, and he spent 6 months preparing for it, and he underwent genetic modification to make his body appear human, and he studied their language and their culture and their history until he could pass as one of them. He entered human space through a gap in their border patrols, and he made his way to one of their inner worlds, and he found work as a laborer in one of their shipyards, and he began to watch and listen and learn. What he discovered over the next 3 years changed everything he thought he knew about the galaxy. The humans had not been idle during their century of silence, and they had been building an empire of war that would make the Concord tremble. Every human world was a fortress, and Thiessen saw the hidden weapons, platforms buried beneath the surfaces of peaceful-looking cities, and he saw the defensive grids that could turn entire planets into death traps, and he saw the bunkers where millions of civilians could shelter during orbital bombardment. But the civilians themselves were the greatest shock. Every human adult was trained in combat from the age of 16, and they could assemble and fire weapons, and they could treat battlefield injuries, and they could survive in hostile environments, and they could kill with their bare hands if necessary. They were not soldiers by profession, but they were all soldiers by preparation, and the entire human population was ready to fight at a moment's notice. Thiessen infiltrated deeper into their military structure, and he found their shipyards where vessels were being built that made no sense to his trained eyes. The human ships were small compared to Concord designs, but they were fast beyond anything he had ever seen, and they carried weapons that the Concord had never encountered: gravity lances that could crush the hull of a battleship from thousands of kilometers away, and quantum disruptors that could erase matter at the atomic level, and missile systems that could track and destroy targets across entire solar systems. But the true horror lay deeper still. Thiessen found his way into a classified research facility, and he discovered what the humans called their insurance policy. They had mapped the biology of every species in the Concord, and they had designed pathogens and poisons and weapons tailored to each one, and they had tested these weapons in secret laboratories, and they knew exactly how to kill every alien race in the galaxy. The Rithaki plague was just the beginning, and there were similar weapons ready for the Velith and the Morith and all the other species who had left. At humanity's warning, and there was more, Thiessen discovered that humanity had been sending agents into Concord space for decades, and these sleeper operatives had infiltrated every major world and every government and every military installation. And they were waiting for a single command. They were not there to spy, and they were not there to sabotage, and they were there to deploy the biological weapons if humanity was ever threatened with extinction. The humans called it mutually assured extinction, and it meant that if the Concord ever destroyed humanity, then humanity would destroy every species in the fund. Concord in return. Thiessen found the document that explained the entire program, and he read it with growing horror, and he realized that the humans had turned themselves into a dead man's switch that would destroy the galaxy if they fell. He copied everything he could, and he made his escape from human space, and he traveled back to the Concord with his evidence, and he requested an immediate meeting with the full council. The council members gathered in their great chamber, and Thiessen stood before them, and he told them what he had found, and he showed them the evidence he had gathered. The chamber fell silent, and the great powers of the galaxy sat in stunned disbelief as they realized what they were facing. They have weapons designed to kill each of us specifically. The Rithaki representative said, her mandibles clicking with barely controlled terror. They can end our species whenever they choose, and their sleeper agents are already on our worlds. A Velith commander added, we cannot root them out without revealing how much we know, and if we try, they might trigger their weapons preemptively. Corso sat in silence for a long moment, and his 4 eyes stared at the data scrolling across the displays, and he thought about the small human admiral who had warned him a century ago. What have we done? He whispered. We laughed at them, and we dismissed them, and we gave them 100 years to prepare, and they used every moment of it. Thiessen stood before the council, and he delivered his final assessment. The humans do not want war, he said. They want to be left alone, and they built all of this because they knew we would not listen to their warning, and they were right. He paused, and his forearms hung at his sides in a gesture of helplessness. If we attack them, we might win the battle, but we will lose our species. He continued, and if we leave them alone, they will never use these weapons against us, and the choice seems obvious to me. But Thiessen knew the Concord, and he knew that pride and fear were a dangerous combination, and he knew that some of the council members would rather risk annihilation than accept that a younger species had outmaneuvered them. The galaxy stood at a crossroads, and the wrong choice would mean the end of everything. And somewhere in human space, the descendants of Admiral Tanaka watched and waited and hoped that the Concord would choose wisely, but they prepared for the alternative just in case. The Concord Council debated for 3 months, and in that time, 3 factions emerged from the chaos of fear and anger and wounded pride. The Velith led the first faction, and they demanded immediate war with all the strength the Concord could gather. And they refused to live under the threat of annihilation from a species that should have been nothing more than servants. Carousel stood before the council, and his voice thundered through the chamber as he made his argument. We have ruled this galaxy for 50,000 years. He roared. We have crushed rebellions and conquered empires and absorbed every species that dared to challenge us. And we will not bow to these humans who have been in space for barely 3 centuries. The Morith led the second faction, and they urged diplomacy and caution, and they pointed to Thiessen's report, and they argued that humanity had not attacked unprovoked. They only defended themselves against the Rithaki invasion. The Morith ambassador said, they have not launched attacks against our worlds, and they have not used their sleeper agents, and perhaps they truly do want nothing more than to be left in peace. the Rithaki led the third faction, and they demanded genocide, and they swore that they would not rest until every human was dead, and their worlds were burned to ash. The new Rithaki Queen Admiral had taken power after Vashkira's death, and she carried her predecessor's hatred like a sacred flame. They murdered 20,000 of our soldiers with a coward's weapon. She hissed, "They designed a plague specifically to kill our species, and they will pay for this crime with their extinction." The debate raged for weeks, and alliances shifted, and arguments grew heated, and twice the council nearly collapsed into open conflict between its own members. In the end, the war faction won by a narrow margin. The Concord voted to assemble the largest fleet in galactic history and to crush humanity once and for all, and to take their worlds and their technology, and to ensure that no other young species would ever dare to challenge the established order again. 12,000 warships gathered at the edge of human space, and they represented every species in the 1,000 warships gathered at the edge of human space, and they represented the edge of human space, and they represented every species in the Sinan space Concord, and they carried enough firepower to destroy 100 worlds. Admiral Korath of the Veloth took command of the combined fleet, and he looked at the star charts, showing human territory, and he felt nothing but confidence in his coming victory. They may have surprised the Rithaki, he told his officers, but they have never faced the full might of the Concord, and no amount of preparation can save them from what we are about to unleash. The fleet crossed into human space, and they expected to find desperate defenses and outnumbered forces, and a species fighting for survival against impossible odds. Instead, they found the threshold. The humans had turned the entire border region into a killing field, and every asteroid and every moon and every piece of debris had been converted into a weapon mines, drifted in the darkness, and they were smart enough to identify targets and fast enough to catch any ship and powerful enough to crack hulls with a single detonation. Drones swarmed from hidden bases, and they attacked in waves of thousands, and when the Concord destroyed them, more appeared to take their place, and they never seemed to. And then the human ships arrived. They were small compared to the massive Concord battleships, but they moved with impossible speed, and they struck from angles that should have been impossible, and they vanished before the Concord weapons could lock onto them. The gravity lances tore through Concord formations and crushed ships like insects, and the quantum disruptors erased vessels from existence without leaving debris, and the human missiles tracked their targets across millions of kilometers with perfect accuracy. Admiral Korath watched his fleet die around him, and he could not understand how this was happening. He had 12,000 ships, and the humans seemed to have only hundreds, and yet those hundreds were tearing his armada apart piece by piece. Fall back, he ordered after the first hour. Regroup and reform our lines. But there was no falling back in the threshold, and every retreat led into another minefield, and every regrouping was interrupted by another drone swarm, and every attempt to reform was shattered by another human strike force. 4,000 Concord ships died in the first hour, and the humans had not lost a single capital vessel. The battle continued for 9 hours, and by the end, the Concord fleet was broken and scattered, and the survivors fled in every direction, and they carried tailies of impossible weapons and unstoppable enemies. Admiral Korath died on his flagship when a gravity lance crushed the bridge around him at his last transmission was a single desperate warning to the Concord Council: do not send more ships. He gasped as the metal closed around him. They are not what we thought they were, and they are not prey. And they are the hunters, and we are the ones being hunted. The Concord received the news of the defeat in stunned silence, and they watched the recordings from the surviving ships, and they saw their greatest fleet reduced to debris in less than a day. And then the humans responded: a single transmission, broadcast across every frequency, and it reached every world in the Concord, and it carried a message that would change the galaxy forever. Admiral Chen Wei stood on the bridge of the human flagship. Victory on her face was calm as she addressed the species that had tried to destroy her people. "You were warned," she said. 100 years ago, Admiral Tanaka stood before your council, and she told you what would happen if you came for us, and you laughed at her." She paused, and her eyes seemed to look directly at every being who watched. "You are not laughing now," she continued, "and this battle was only a demonstration of what we can do, and we have not yet begun to show you our true capabilities." Her expression hardened, and her voice carried the weight of a century of preparation. "The next phase begins now," she said, "and you will finally understand why humanity should never have been ignored." The transmission ended, and they, Concord, waited in terror for what would come next. They did not have to wait long. The Concord expected invasion fleets and orbital bombardments and armies marching through their cities, and they prepared for war on a scale the galaxy had never seen. But humanity did not invade, and they did not occupy, and they did something far worse. On every Concord homeworld, at exactly the same moment, the sleeper agents activated. They did not release the biological weapons, and they did not assassinate leaders, and they did not sabotage military installations. Instead, they broadcast a message. Every screen on every world lit up with the same image, and every device played the same words, and every surface capable of displaying information showed the face of Admiral Yuki Tanaka. She was old now, and her hair was white, and her face was lined with a century of burden, but her eyes were the same cold steel they had been when she first warned the Concord. 100 years ago, citizens of the Concord, she said, and her voice reached billions of beings across thousands of light years. You are watching this because your leaders ignored my warning, and they sent their fleet to destroy my people, and they failed. She paused and let the weight of her words settle over the watching galaxy. I want you to understand something. She continued, humanity has never wanted war, and we have never wanted conquest. And we have never wanted anything except to live in peace on our own worlds. Her expression shifted, and there was something almost like sadness in her eyes. But your leaders would not allow that, she said. They demanded our submission, and they laughed at our warning. And they sent armies to take our colonies, and they assembled the greatest fleet in galactic history to exterminate us. The image changed and showed recordings of the battle. Of the threshold, and the watching billions saw 12,000 Concord ships torn apart by human weapons, and they saw the debris fields stretching across millions of kilometers. This is what happens when you underestimate humanity, Tanaka said as the images played. This is what happens when you mistake our desire for peace for weakness. The screen showed her face again, and now there was no sadness, only iron determination. I am going to make you an offer, she said. And I suggest you consider it very carefully, because it is the only offer you will receive. She straightened in her chair, and her voice took on the tone of someone delivering a verdict. The Concord of 12 will dissolve immediately, and each species will govern itself without interference from the others. And there will be no more forced integration of younger species, and there will be no more provision demanding submission. The watching billions stirred with confusion and anger, but Tanaka was not finished. Humanity will withdraw behind our borders once more, and we will ask nothing from you, and we will take nothing from you, and we will leave you to rebuild your governments however you choose. She leaned forward, and her eyes seemed to pierce through the screens into the souls of every being who watched. But if any species ever threatens human space again, then Project Mutually Assured Extinction will activate, she said. Every biological weapon we have designed will be deployed by our sleeper agents, and every relativistic kill vehicle we have aimed at your homeworlds will be launched, and the species that threatens us will simply cease to exist. She let that sink in for a long moment. This is not a threat, she said quietly. This is a promise, and it is backed by a century of preparation, and it is enforced by agents already living among you who cannot be found and cannot be stopped. The image flickered and showed something that made the Concorde. Leaders freeze in terror. It showed the locations of the sleeper agents on every Concorde homeworld, and it showed the hidden caches of biological weapons, and it showed the targeting data for the relativistic kill vehicles, and then the information vanished and left only Tanaka's face. "You see," she said with something that might have been a smile, "we could have killed you all already, and we chose not to because humanity does not want to rule the galaxy, and we do not want to destroy other species, and we only want to be left alone." The message shifted to show the current Concorde Council sitting in their great chamber, and they looked small and afraid compared to the image of the old human Admiral Coruscant, the Velith ambassador, who had laughed at Tanaka a century ago, rose from his seat, and his voice trembled as he asked the question that haunted every member of the council. "How can you live with such cruelty inside you?" he demanded. "How can your species create weapons designed to exterminate entire civilizations and still call yourselves peaceful?" Tanaka smiled, and there was no warmth in it, but there was something like understanding. "We do not live with it," she replied. "We survived with it, and that is the difference between your species and ours." She stood from her chair and walked closer to whatever device was recording her, and her face filled the screens across the galaxy. "You evolved as the apex predators of your worlds," she said. "You were the strongest and the fastest and the deadliest, and you never learned what it meant to be prey." Her voice dropped lower and carried the weight of 200,000 years of human struggle. "Humanity was prey for most of our existence," she said. "We were hunted by predators with sharper teeth, and we were killed by diseases we could not see, and we were starved by winters that lasted for years, and we were slaughtered by members of our own species who wanted what we had." She paused, and her eyes were ancient with the memory of countless generations of suffering. "We learned something that you never had to learn," she continued. "We learned that the most dangerous creature in any ecosystem is not the one with the biggest claws or the sharpest fangs, and the most dangerous creature is the one that refuses to die." She stepped back, and her voice filled with quiet certainty. "Humanity refused to die on Earth, and we refused to die when the ice came, and we refused to die when the plague swept our cities, and we refused to die when we turned our weapons on each other, and we refuse to die now." Her final words were a promise and a warning and a declaration of everything humanity had become. "Accept our offer and rebuild your civilizations in peace," she said, "or reject it and discover what happens when you push a survivor species to its absolute limit." The transmission ended and the galaxy fell silent. The Concorde Council voted within the hour, and they accepted the terms without a single dissenting voice. The alliance dissolved, and each species retreated to its own territory, and the great powers that had ruled the galaxy for 50,000 years scattered like frightened children, and humanity withdrew behind its borders once more. And they watched the galaxy reorganize itself, and they hoped that the lesson had been learned. Admiral Tanaka died peacefully 3 years later, and her last words were recorded and broadcast to every human world. "We did not win a war today," she said. "We prevented one, and the greatest victory is the battle that never has to be fought, and I hope our children and our children's children will never have to use the weapons we built." She closed her eyes and smiled. "But if they do, then let the galaxy remember that we gave them a warning, and we gave them a choice, and they chose to ignore us." Her voice faded to a whisper. "Never ignore humanity." The galaxy entered a new era, and the old order crumbled, and new alliances formed, and new conflicts arose. But through it all, every species remembered the lesson they had learned. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, humanity waited, and they were not conquerors, and they were not rulers, and they were simply survivors who had proven that the most dangerous thing in the universe was a species that had learned to refuse extinction, and they hoped they would never have to prove it again. But they were ready if they did.